Hey guys, sorry for the weird view and if my skin is a little bit orange. The lighting up here is terrible, but like many of us, me and my partner are kind of trapped inside the same house. And I'm thinking since he has, school and I am making booktube videos, he gets the office. So this is gonna be a view for a little bit here. I am back to do yet another episode of my American Presidents series. If you don't know, I can link to some of the other videos. They're all over the channel, but basically I am trying to read a biography on every single United States president. It's been a crazy, crazy adventure, and I am steadily moving forward. This episode today is going to cover the biographies that I have read from James Garfield to William McKinley. Minus, of course, poor Benjamin Harrison. I am so far working through audiobooks that I can get through my local library, and so far I have not been able to find an audiobook on Benjamin Harrison. So anybody that I can't get an audiobook on, I am going to go backwards and read a textbook on. But when I started this adventure about almost 2 years ago now, I was in school and I really didn't want to read books, like nonfiction books, while I was also getting my master's degrees. Those are thankfully over with. So maybe I will start backtracking and getting some of those presidents that I missed. But anyway, forget about Benjamin Harrison for a second. We have to go back to James Garfield. So for James Garfield, I read Destiny of the Republic, A Tale of Madness, Medicine, and the Murder of a President by Candace Miller. I wasn't super sure about this being my James Garfield book. It's not your standard biography. It intertwines the story of James Garfield with the life and times of Alexander Graham Bell, and also of the man who eventually shoots and mostly assassinates James Garfield, Charles Guiteau. And that's where you get, madness and medicine. Alexander Graham Bell, when Guiteau shoots Garfield, is really helpful in trying to medically save him, because the period of time between when Garfield gets shot and when he dies is pretty extended, considering that, Abraham Lincoln dies the same night. So it's a really interesting time in American politics, who is in charge. There is still a president. He seems to be recovering, and then he isn't, and it's a really up and down period of time. So I was actually glad that this book, rather than spreading out James Garfield's entire life and giving you a look-see at all of that, really did take a lot of time between when he gets shot and when he eventually dies, because it really just gives you a really interesting snapshot of what then seems to be a super extended period of time, but really isn't in the grand scheme of James Garfield's life. So while I do feel like I could have done a longer biography on just James Garfield, this was a really special reading experience. So if you're a presidential scholar, this probably isn't the book that you'd want to read in order to get, all the nitty-gritty, juicy details on James Garfield as a person and a president. But I'm glad that I read it because it was super, super interesting. But with that being said, I almost can't remember a single thing about James Garfield's life or presidency to tell you. I could tell you all about the invention of air conditioners for poor James Garfield as he's laid up, or, how cuckoo, absolutely just not right in the head, the person who assassinated him was. He's often called a deranged office seeker, but there is so much more to Charles Guiteau than just deranged office seeker, which really isn't true. But yeah, doesn't do a lot for the presidential thing, huh? Maybe I should read another one. We'll see. So James Garfield eventually succumbs to his wounds and dies, and his vice president, Chester A. Arthur, becomes president. And Chester A. Arthur, they didn't just want him to never be president. People didn't even want him to be vice president. It was a thing that nobody was excited about. And James Garfield was very beloved, obviously had this drawn-out death experience that really, wrapped up the hearts of the nation. And Chester A. Arthur, is now president. The book I read for Chester Arthur is The Unexpected President, The Life and Times of Chester A. Arthur by Scott S. Greenberger. I think my main takeaway about Chester A. Arthur is that Chester Arthur was a machine politician for most of his career. This is at a time in American politics where most elections, most people running for office, they're all decided, those people are owned by big party machines. And so, like, for example, New York City is owned by a couple of different people who decide who the candidates are for their party and who's really going to win the election. They get people out to vote. It's a really, really big deal. It comes up a lot in this era, and it really controls American politics for a serious period of time. And so Chester Arthur is the creature of one of New York's biggest machine politicians, Roscoe Conkling, who in and of himself, I think I need to read a book on him. He's super interesting. And he really is pushing Chester Arthur to new political heights. And but then Chester Arthur is offered the post of the vice president, and Roscoe Conkling goes, "No, don't you dare." And Chester Arthur's like, I mean, I could be a really, really good vice president. Arthur loved entertaining. He liked nice clothes. So the idea of this ornamental office of the vice president, where it really left him not much to do but entertain, he was all for that. So he's like, yeah, vice president, this is great. And Roscoe Conkling is like, no, 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 no. Well, Chester A. Arthur does become vice president, and then suddenly he's the president. And Roscoe Conkling is like, this was the best idea I ever had. This is great. You can do all these things for me now. And Chester Arthur's like, no. So all of a sudden, someone who people really thought was just going to be a product of the machine really becomes someone who does his best for the presidency. So Chester A. Arthur might have been an unexpected president, but he tried his best, and he did as best he knew how, even though he never wanted to be president or didn't really even seem to enjoy it. So, thanks, Chester. So after Chester A. Arthur comes Grover Cleveland, and for Grover I read An Honest President, The Life and Presidencies of Grover Cleveland by H. Paul Jeffers. And if you're like, Gretchen, did you just say presidencies? Yes, I did, because Grover Cleveland is one of those weird presidents that always comes up in President's Trivia, which I know is something all the cool kids play, because he is president twice, non-consecutively. So far in our history, he is the only president to have done that. The first time he is elected is, again, following Chester Arthur. He sweeps into office, does a lot of great things, gets married to a girl who he knew as a kid. People thought that Grover was courting her mom because they were of the same age, and then he married her daughter. I get really hung up on this in this book, I'm going to be honest with you. They get married, seem to have a super happy life. Good for them. So then Grover is voted out of office. They decide, he was an okay president, but not really. And then they elect Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison serves a term, and then Grover runs again, and people are like, oh, remember Grover? He was actually pretty good as president. And they re-elect him. Crazy, right? It's kind of like, this is good, but we could do better. And then you get something else, and then you're like, oh, no, that thing we had previously was actually way, way better. And I guess that's what the people of America thought when it came to Grover Cleveland. I have to admit that other than the whole thing where he married someone half his age, mostly what I took away about Grover Cleveland in this book was that he really, really tried to be honest. Grover Cleveland, for example, had a son out of wedlock, and this is a huge no-no, and during his election, people tried to use that against him. And instead, he just came out and said, yes, this happened, whatever. And people really liked his honesty. I like to think that it's a little bit like when Alexander Hamilton wrote the Reynolds pamphlet, and he was like, people will think that this is great. And people did not react that way to Alexander Hamilton, but Grover Cleveland came on in an age with all the machine politicians. Politics were getting really dirty at this point, and he just came out and said, "This is who I am, this is what I believe," and all of it was the truth. And people really, really responded to that enough to elect him president twice non-consecutively. So the biography itself was okay. Some of it I just tuned out. I feel like Chester Arthur and Grover Cleveland's books had the same thing, where they were solid 3-star books, but they didn't really super hold my attention. So, is it a fault of the times, or is it the fault of the book? Sometimes it's really hard to tell. Again, in between Grover Cleveland, you have Benjamin Harrison, who I don't have a book for yet. Nobody cares, apparently. But then after the second Grover Cleveland presidency, we get William McKinley. The book that I read for William McKinley is not a good representation of his entire life and presidencies. He's definitely a president that I want to return to eventually, but I really enjoyed the focus of the book that I did read on him, and that was The Triumph of William McKinley, Why the Election of 1896 Still Matters by Karl Rove. First of all, Karl Rove should never have been allowed to narrate his own audiobook. Let me tell you. Because he tries to impersonate Teddy Roosevelt, and Teddy Roosevelt is the only person who gets their own accent. Some audiobook narrators, they'll do, different accents for every person. Some don't bother. Karl Rove just does one for Teddy Roosevelt, and it's terrible. It's super bad. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, is William McKinley's vice president. This becomes super important when William McKinley is assassinated, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Essentially, the point of Karl Rove's book is that William McKinley's campaign for president in 1896 entirely changes the way that presidential elections have been run up until that point. And the nitty-gritty that he gets into, the way that William McKinley's whole rise to power changes how these elections work, it's incredible, and I wouldn't be able to enumerate them for you properly here. But if instead of a president's life, you're interested in how presidential elections work and how presidential elections have changed and what we have come to take as the norm in a presidential election really was changed, thinking about the history of America relatively recently in 1896 is really, really fascinating. And of course, the problem with this book, like I said, is that it kind of stops when he is elected president. Obviously, there is a lot of stuff that happens after that. I wish that the book had continued. And again, William McKinley is definitely a president that I have to return to, but this was the only audiobook on him in my library system at the time of reading, so I read it. Again, don't listen to the audiobook because Karl Rove should not be allowed to impersonate anybody, but like I said, if you're interested in election politics versus presidency, this is really fascinating, and I haven't read another book like it. So that's it for me today. I will be returning next time, starting with Theodore Roosevelt, one of our wildest presidents, that's for sure. And I will see you then. Thanks, guys.